Have you ever felt overwhelmed by challenges that seem impossible to overcome? Those moments when fear and uncertainty make it feel like defeat is inevitable? We all go through situations like this, where despair threatens to take over. But what if there was a way to turn the impossible into the possible? In this video, we will explore the story of Esther, an ordinary woman who, when faced with a tremendous challenge, found the courage and faith to save her people. We'll discover how the lessons from this story can apply to your life, showing that even in the most difficult situations, there is hope, strength, and a way out. If you've ever faced moments where it seemed there was no solution, this story is for you. Share in the comments what kind of situation you've faced, and let's discover together how Esther overcame fear, found her purpose, and changed her destiny. Because just like her, you too can find the strength to overcome any challenge that comes your way. Imagine the splendor of King Xerxes' palace, one of the greatest kings the world has ever known. Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, ruled a vast and powerful empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia. To celebrate the grandeur of his kingdom, the king decided to host a monumental banquet. This was no ordinary feast. It was a celebration that would last 180 days, 6 months of continuous food, wine, and revelry. The palace was decorated with indescribable luxury. White and blue linen tapestries hung from marble columns, fastened with silver rings. Gold and silver were spread throughout the courtyard, and the floor was paved with precious stones and colorful marble. Nothing was spared. King Xerxes wanted to show everyone the wealth and power of his empire. On the final day of this great feast, the king organized a special banquet for the nobles and officials of the kingdom. There was an abundance of wine, served in golden goblets, each one different from the other. Xerxes, in his pride, was proud of all that he had built. He wanted everyone to know that he was the greatest of all kings. And to crown this display of power, he decided to show off the beauty of his queen, Vashti. Vashti was known for her extraordinary beauty. She was a majestic queen, and the king, confident in his position, ordered Vashti to come to the banquet to be displayed before his guests. Imagine the scene. The hall full of men intoxicated by wine and power, and the king demanding that his wife be paraded like a mere trophy. But Vashti was not just any woman. She was a queen of dignity and respect. When the king's servants came to summon her, Vashti made a bold decision. She refused to obey the king's order. She knew that being displayed in such a manner before drunken men would be a humiliation, an offense to her dignity as a queen and as a woman. Vashti's response was an act of courage, but also one of great risk. By refusing to attend, she challenged the absolute power of the king. When the message of her refusal reached Xerxes' ears, he was furious. His anger burned within him like an uncontrollable fire. How dare Vashti disobey him, the king of the entire Persian Empire? The news of Vashti's disobedience quickly spread through the palace. The king's advisors, men more concerned with order and their own status than with justice, began to murmur. If the queen disobeys the king, they said, what would stop other women from doing the same? We must act so that Vashti's example does not spread. Thus, under the influence of his advisors, Xerxes made a drastic decision. Vashti was stripped of her title as queen. Her act of courage cost her the throne, but it also paved the way for a new queen to be chosen. A woman who, unknowingly, was destined to save the Jewish people from an impending tragedy. The banquet of Xerxes and Vashti's deposition were not just grand events or whims of a powerful king. They marked the beginning of a series of events that would change the fate of an entire people. With Queen Vashti's sudden departure, King Xerxes' great palace was filled with unease. The throne beside the king was empty, and this could not last long. A kingdom as powerful as Xerxes needed a queen, a woman worthy of standing by the sovereign's side. But this would not be a simple choice, and Xerxes did not want to make another mistake. He needed someone who was not only beautiful but also wise, graceful, and capable of inspiring the respect of everyone around her. The king's advisors, sensing the urgent need to restore order and prestige in the palace, suggested a bold plan: a search throughout the empire for the most beautiful and virtuous young women. It was like a great competition, where the most deserving would become the new queen of Persia. A decree was issued, and soon the king's emissaries traveled every corner of the vast empire, from Egypt to India, searching for the most enchanting women to bring them to the palace of Susa. Among these young women was a girl who, at first glance, did not seem destined for greatness. Her name was Hadassah, though she was better known by her Persian name, Esther. She was a young Jewish girl, orphaned from a young age, raised with love and dedication by her older cousin, Mordecai. He taught her wisely, instilling values of faith and righteousness. Esther did not have the advantages of many other noble young women brought to the palace. She did not come from a wealthy family, nor did she have luxurious jewelry or clothing. But Esther possessed something no one else could match, an inner beauty that radiated through her humility, kindness, and unwavering faith. When the king's emissaries arrived in the city where Esther lived, her life changed forever. They immediately noticed her beauty, but it was her grace and character that stood out. Mordecai, though concerned for his young cousin's safety, knew this was an opportunity she could not refuse. Thus, he advised her to hide her true identity and not reveal that she was Jewish, at least until she knew more about what the future held. Esther was taken to the palace of Susa, where she joined other young women from across the empire, all hoping for the same fate, to be chosen as the new queen. They were placed under the care of Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the royal harem. For 12 months, Esther and the other young women underwent a period of preparation, where they were treated with the finest perfumes and cosmetics, and learned the manners and customs of the court. Despite all this external preparation, what really made Esther stand out was her personality. She quickly won Haggai's favor, who not only admired her but also helped her in every way he could. He saw something deeper in her than just physical beauty, something that made her different from all the others. Esther was like a rare flower that, despite her humble origins, blossomed radiantly, showing an inner strength and grace that could not be ignored. When the day came for Esther to be presented to King Xerxes, there was tension in the air. The other young women had displayed their jewels and magnificent garments, trying to impress the king with all they had. But Esther, following Haggai's advice, requested only what he suggested. She trusted that her simplicity and character would speak louder than any external adornment. And so, Esther was brought into the king's presence. When Xerxes saw her, something different happened. It wasn't just her physical beauty that captivated him, but also her serene presence and the mystery that surrounded her. He felt an immediate connection, something he had not felt with any other. Without hesitation, the king placed the royal crown on Esther's head, proclaiming her the new queen of Persia. This coronation was not just the beginning of a new life, but also the first step in a much greater divine plan. Little did she know that as queen, she would face challenges that would test her courage and faith to the limit, leading her to a destiny that would forever change the history of the Jewish people. Leave a like to continue encouraging us to produce content like this, and comment if you were already familiar with the story of Esther. Esther, now queen, kept her secret. She knew that the role she was about to play would require wisdom, courage, and faith. Even without revealing her Jewish identity, Esther understood that there was a greater purpose behind her rise to the throne. What seemed like a simple tale of a humble young woman becoming queen was, in fact, the prelude to a mission that would challenge her courage and define the destiny of her people. As she adapted to life in the palace, her cousin and guardian, Mordecai, also played an important role within the kingdom. Mordecai was a wise and devout man who always kept a close watch on the events around him, especially concerning Esther's safety and, by extension, that of King Xerxes himself. He spent his days near the palace gates, listening and observing, ever vigilant. One day, while Mordecai was at the palace gate, he overheard something that made his heart race. Two of the king's eunuchs, responsible for guarding the entrance to the royal chamber, were engaged in a suspicious conversation. What began as a murmur quickly turned into a sinister plot. As Mordecai listened intently, he realized that the two men were plotting nothing less than the assassination of King Xerxes. These men, who should have been loyal servants, had become embittered by some offense or dissatisfaction and decided that the king must die. Their plan was clear: to use their proximity to the king to carry out a surprise attack, ensuring that Xerxes would not survive. Faced with this discovery, Mordecai knew he had to act quickly. The fate of the kingdom, and possibly Esther's safety, was at stake. With a heavy but determined heart, Mordecai decided that the only way to prevent this terrible crime was to inform Esther. He sent an urgent message to the queen, detailing the conspiracy he had uncovered. When Esther received Mordecai's message, she immediately understood the gravity of the situation. She also knew she needed to act quickly and wisely. Without hesitation, Esther went to the king and revealed the eunuch's plot, citing the information she had received from Mordecai. Xerxes, upon hearing his queen's words, was deeply disturbed. An attempt on his life, coming from men so close to him, was an unforgivable betrayal. The king ordered an immediate investigation to confirm the truth of the accusations. When the details were examined, the conspiracy was proven true. Bigthan and Teresh were arrested and swiftly met the punishment they deserved for their treason. They were executed, and peace was restored in the palace. But Mordecai's heroic act was not forgotten. Xerxes, even amid his many responsibilities and crises, ordered that Mordecai's name and deed be recorded in the Book of Chronicles, where great events and the deeds of worthy men were immortalized. This seemingly simple record would become crucial in the future, though no one in the palace knew it yet. Mordecai did not seek glory or reward for his actions. He simply did what was right, guided by his loyalty to the king and his love for Esther. However, this act, which saved Xerxes' life, once again showed that God was silently working behind the scenes, setting the stage for what was to come. Mordecai's faithfulness and Esther's readiness planted the seeds for a future where courage and truth would triumph over evil. In the heart of the vast Persian Empire, where power and pride reigned supreme, there emerged a man whose ambition and arrogance would threaten not only the stability of the kingdom but the very survival of a people. This man was Haman, son of Hammedatha. He was one of King Xerxes' highest officials, and his status in the palace rose even further when the king, in a move that would alter the fate of many, decided to promote Haman to a position of great authority. He became the second most powerful man in the empire, answering only to the king himself. With this promotion, Haman not only gained power but also the right to demand respect and reverence from all around him. The king's decree ordered all the palace servants to bow and pay homage to him whenever he passed. For Haman, this act of reverence was more than a formality. It was an affirmation of his superiority, a tribute to his insatiable ego, and everyone obeyed, almost everyone. Among those who served at the palace gate was Mordecai, Esther's cousin, who until then had lived in relative peace, observing everything with wisdom and discernment. Mordecai, a Jew faithful to his beliefs and traditions, was well aware of his people's history. He knew that the Agagites, from whom Haman descended, were ancient enemies of the Israelites. But it wasn't just history that prevented him from bowing. It was his faith. Mordecai believed that only God deserved such honor. Bowing before Haman would be a violation of everything he believed in. Thus, day after day, while the other servants of the king bowed before Haman, Mordecai stood firm, upright, without yielding. He kept his gaze steady, without fear, as Haman passed by. At first, Haman might not have noticed Mordecai's resistance. But over time, the other servants began to notice Mordecai's boldness and questioned him about his disobedience. They repeatedly asked him why he did not bow, but Mordecai remained steadfast in his decision, revealing to them that it was because of his faith and his Jewish identity. Eventually, the news reached Haman. Upon discovering that Mordecai, a mere servant, dared to defy his authority and refused to bow, Haman's fury knew no bounds. To him, this was not just a personal affront. It was an insult that needed to be punished in an exemplary manner. But instead of acting impulsively against Mordecai, Haman began to devise a much darker plan. He did not just want to punish Mordecai. He wanted to eliminate everyone who shared his faith. Thus, Mordecai's refusal became the spark that ignited an unrelenting hatred. Consumed by rage and the desire for revenge, Haman decided that destroying Mordecai would not be enough. he conceived a plan to exterminate all the Jews in the Persian Empire, a genocide that would ensure that no one would dare challenge him again. And with the power he held in his hands, Haman knew he could convince King Xerxes to approve his cruel plan. What began as one man's simple act of resistance would become a battle for the survival of an entire people. By refusing to bow before Haman, Mordecai not only defied a powerful man, but also set in motion a series of events that would reveal courage, faith, and divine providence. However, Haman was still unaware that he was not merely confronting a stubborn servant. He was facing God's own plan for the salvation of his people. Xerxes, unaware of Haman's true intentions and not knowing that his own queen, Esther, belonged to the Jewish people, agreed to the proposal. He handed Haman his signet ring, the symbol of ultimate authority, allowing him to issue a decree in the king's name. With this power in hand, Haman moved swiftly. He drafted a decree that ordered the extermination of all Jews, young and old, women and children, all in a single day. The day of the massacre was marked on the Persian calendar, the 13th day of the month of Adar. Orders were sent by messengers to all the provinces of the empire, from India to Ethiopia. Every city, every village would receive the terrible news. Soon, they would be authorized to kill all the Jews they found, seize their possessions, and wipe out their existence from the face of the earth. When the decree reached the Jewish communities, the impact was devastating. Imagine the terror and despair that spread among the Jewish families as they read the royal edict. A feeling of helplessness gripped everyone. The future that once seemed secure was now threatened with extinction. Men and women wept, children asked what would happen, and no one had answers. Everywhere, the Jews dressed in sackcloth and covered themselves in ashes, a sign of mourning and despair. Meanwhile, Haman, satisfied with the success of his plan, celebrated with the king. To him, everything was going according to plan. The decree was sealed, the fate of the Jews was decided, and he had no doubt that soon he would rid himself of Mordecai and all his kin. Yet, amid the sea of darkness and uncertainty, a light still shone. God, who seemed silent, was already working behind the scenes. The same Mordecai who had been the cause of Haman's hatred, and the same Esther who had been chosen to be queen under such extraordinary circumstances, would become instruments in divine hands to reverse this terrible decree. But at that moment, the Jews could only cry out to God for mercy. In every home, prayers were lifted, eyes turned toward heaven, seeking hope amid despair. And even in the face of a death sentence, there was a firm faith that God, who had guided them for so many centuries, would not abandon them now. Mordecai was not a man who easily gave in to despair, but the gravity of the situation required an act of profound humility and supplication. He dressed in sackcloth, a simple and coarse garment typically reserved for moments of great sorrow. Moreover, he covered himself with ashes, an external sign of his inner pain and lamentation for the fate of his people. Thus, clothed in mourning, Mordecai made his way to the palace gate, where his presence could not be ignored. His appearance caught the attention of many. It was unusual to see someone dressed so miserably in that place, and soon the news spread. Mordecai was in mourning. What could have caused such sadness? When Esther's maidservants learned what was happening, they quickly informed the queen. Esther, who was protected by the palace walls, was still unaware of the magnitude of the crisis unfolding outside. Upon hearing of Mordecai's condition, she became deeply concerned. Esther tried to send clothes to Mordecai so that he could change out of the sackcloth, hoping this would ease his distress. But Mordecai refused the clothes, knowing that the root of the problem could not be solved with a simple gesture of comfort. Instead, he sent Esther a message containing the most important words he had ever spoken. Through a messenger, Mordecai explained everything that was happening to Esther. He detailed the decree issued by Haman, describing the horror that was about to befall the Jewish people. But Mordecai did not stop there. He made an urgent appeal to Esther. She needed to intervene. As queen, she had direct access to King Xerxes, and Mordecai believed that only she could save the Jews from imminent destruction. He asked Esther to go before the king and plead for the lives of her people. However, Mordecai's request placed Esther in an extremely dangerous position. At that time, no one, not even the queen, could approach the king without being summoned. Anyone who dared to appear before the king uninvited could be condemned to death unless the king extended his golden scepter as a sign of clemency. Esther knew that risking her life in this way was terrifying, especially considering it had been 30 days since the king last called for her. What if the king did not receive her? What if he decided to punish her for her boldness? Fear began to grip her heart. But Mordecai, knowing the weight of the situation, sent a second message, one that would touch the core of Esther's being. He told her that if she did nothing, deliverance for the Jews would come from another place, but she and her father's house would perish. And then he asked the most profound question. Who knows if perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? These words echoed in Esther's heart. She understood that her destiny was intertwined with the destiny of her people, and that her silence could come at a great cost. Esther's response was as courageous as the position she now held. She sent a message to Mordecai, instructing him to have all the Jews in Susa fast for her for 3 days. She and her maidservants would also fast, seeking God's direction and protection. And then Esther declared, "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." The heavy silence of the 3 days of fasting and prayer hung over the palace of Susa. Esther, along with her maidservants, spent each moment in deep reflection and seeking strength. Outside, the Jews also fasted and prayed, their hearts united in a desperate plea for divine intervention. The danger was real, and everyone knew that the fate of an entire people depended on a single decision. When the 3rd day of fasting ended, Esther rose with resolve. She prepared meticulously, dressing in her royal robes with the dignity of a queen, but also with the humility of a servant of God. Her mind was steadfast, but her heart raced. She knew that this day could be her last, but her faith propelled her forward. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time, took a deep breath, and remembered the words she had spoken to Mordecai. "If I perish, I perish." This was the ultimate expression of her courage and determination. With firm steps, Esther walked toward the throne room. The massive doors of the hall opened for her, and the grand environment enveloped her. There was a palpable tension in the air, for everyone knew that Esther's appearance there, without being summoned, was an act that defied the kingdom's laws. The servants and officials held their breath. All eyes were fixed on the queen who dared to challenge royal protocol. In the center of the hall, seated in all his splendor, was King Xerxes, surrounded by his court. When he lifted his gaze and saw Esther standing at a distance, the room fell into absolute silence. This was the crucial moment. If Xerxes did not extend his golden scepter to Esther, her life would end right then and there. Every second felt like an eternity. Esther, standing there, felt the weight of the king's gaze upon her. Her heart raced, but her faith was stronger. Finally, Xerxes made a move. With a curious expression, he extended the golden scepter toward her. Esther, relieved but maintaining her composure, stepped forward and touched the tip of the scepter. She had won the first battle. She was alive and had the opportunity to speak. The king, realizing that Esther was not there for a simple visit, asked what had brought her to him so urgently. Esther, with all the wisdom and grace that God had given her, did not reveal her request immediately. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she would prepare the next day. Xerxes, intrigued, accepted the invitation, and Haman, feeling honored, also agreed. Thus, the first step was taken. Esther had risked her life and survived. Now, she needed even more courage to reveal her true intention at the right moment. She knew that every move was crucial and that God was guiding her steps. The battle for her people's survival was far from over, but Esther, strengthened by faith and courage, was ready to face whatever came next. The banquet was held. The setting was luxuriously prepared, reflecting the opulence of the Persian court. The tables were covered with the finest linens, and the dishes were served with the most sophisticated delicacies of the empire. Wine flowed generously, and the servants attended to every whim of the guests. In the midst of it all, Esther maintained her calm and graceful demeanor, fully aware that the decisive moment was approaching. During the banquet, King Xerxes, curious to know what truly motivated Esther, finally asked, "What is your request, Queen Esther? What is your desire? Even if it is half of my kingdom, it will be granted to you." The king's words were full of generosity, and he was clearly willing to grant whatever Esther asked for. However, to the king's surprise, Esther did not reveal her true request at that moment. Instead, she chose to delay the crucial moment, likely sensing that the time was not yet ripe. With her wisdom, Esther responded humbly and respectfully, "If it pleases the king, come with Haman to the banquet I will prepare for you tomorrow, and then I will make my request." This response left the king even more intrigued. He knew something important was at stake, but he didn't know what. His curiosity only grew, and this was part of Esther's plan. She knew that by delaying her request, she was creating a tension that would make the king pay even more attention to her words when the time was right. Haman, on the other hand, left the banquet with an even more inflated ego. He felt invincible, convinced that his position was unshakable. Being the only guest, besides the king, invited to a second banquet by the queen only reinforced his perception that he was an indispensable figure in the kingdom. Little did he know that the next banquet would mark the beginning of the end of his evil plans. That night, after the first banquet hosted by Esther, King Xerxes returned to his palace, but something troubled his mind. Even surrounded by all the luxury and comfort a king could desire, he could not find rest. Restless and unable to sleep, Xerxes ordered the chronicles of the kingdom to be brought and read to him. These records contained the important deeds and events of the empire, something the king hoped would help him find some relief for his insomnia. As the scribes read aloud the events of the past, a specific record caught the king's attention. It was the account of how Mordecai, the Jew who worked at the palace gates, had uncovered a deadly conspiracy against Xerxes himself. Two eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, had plotted to assassinate the king, but thanks to Mordecai's vigilance and loyalty, the plan was thwarted and Xerxes was saved. Upon hearing this story, the king paused. Something troubled him. He asked his servants, "What honor and recognition have been given to Mordecai for this act?" The servants, after reviewing the records, replied that nothing had been done to reward him. This discovery left the king perplexed. How could someone who had saved his life not have been justly rewarded? Xerxes knew he had to correct this injustice immediately. That morning, while the king was still contemplating how to honor Mordecai, Haman entered the palace. He came with the intention of asking the king for permission to hang Mordecai on a gallows he had built at his own house. Haman was eager to rid himself of his enemy, unaware that fate was about to play a cruel trick on him. Before Haman could present his request, King Xerxes called him and asked, "What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Haman, in his arrogance, assumed the king was talking about himself. Thinking of how to further increase his own glory, Haman eagerly replied, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, with a royal crown set on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on horseback through the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Haman could hardly contain his excitement as he described the honor he imagined he would receive. But then, the unexpected happened. Xerxes, pleased with the suggestion, said to Haman, "Go at once, get the robes and the horse, just as you have suggested, and do this for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." The impact of these words was devastating for Haman. He felt the ground open beneath his feet. The man he despised so much and planned to kill would now be honored by his own hands. The humiliation was deep and crushing. But with no choice, Haman had to obey the king's orders. With a heavy heart and a face burning with shame, Haman dressed Mordecai in the royal robes, placed him on the king's horse, and led him through the streets of Susa. Along the way, he had to proclaim loudly for all to hear, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." For Mordecai, It was a surprising turn of events. For Haman, it was a blow to his pride like nothing he had ever experienced. When it was all over, Haman returned home humiliated and filled with hatred, ashamed of having been forced to honor his enemy. He recounted what had happened to his wife and friends, and at that moment, the confidence they had in him began to crumble. They realized that, given the events unfolding, Haman's downfall was inevitable. Meanwhile, Mordecai returned to his position at the palace gate, perhaps unaware that the divine plan was unfolding step by step. God's providence was at work, and Haman's humiliation was only the beginning of his downfall. Behind the scenes, justice was being prepared, and the faith of Mordecai and Esther would prove to be more powerful than any conspiracy. The decisive moment had arrived. After the first banquet, where Esther, with remarkable wisdom, delayed the request she held in her heart, the second banquet was about to reveal secrets that would shake the Persian Empire. King Xerxes, curious and eager to discover what motivated his queen to arrange these special gatherings, attended the banquet accompanied by Haman, the man who believed he was rising in power but who was, in fact, about to face his downfall. The hall was prepared with the same magnificence as the previous banquet. The tables were adorned with the finest delicacies. The wine flowed freely, and the atmosphere was one of luxury and exclusivity. But behind this festive appearance, there was palpable tension. Esther knew that the fate of her people rested on the words she would speak that night. She also knew that by revealing her identity, she was putting her own life at risk. But as a queen and as a Jew, Esther had decided that the time to act was now. As the banquet progressed, the king could no longer contain his curiosity. For the second time, he turned to Esther and asked, "What is your request, Queen Esther? What is your desire? Even if it is half of my kingdom, it will be granted to you." The king's words were generous, but Esther knew she needed to be careful in her response. Everything depended on how she approached the matter. Esther, with her heart pounding, finally found the courage to speak. She rose gracefully, looked directly into the king's eyes, and said, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my request. And spare my people, this is my desire. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." These words fell like a bomb in the hall. The king, shocked and confused, immediately asked, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" He was furious, unable to imagine that someone would dare to threaten the life of his queen and her people. Esther then revealed the truth she had kept secret until that moment. The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. The impact of this revelation was profound. The color drained from Haman's face, who had until then felt secure in his position. He was paralyzed with fear, knowing that everything he had plotted was now on the verge of collapse. King Xerxes, seized with uncontrollable rage, abruptly rose and left the hall, going to the palace garden. He needed to process what he had just heard. His trust had been betrayed by the man he had promoted and in whom he had placed his confidence. Not only was his queen, but also an entire people, in danger because of Haman's villainy. Xerxes knew he had to make a quick and decisive decision. While the king was outside, Haman, in complete despair, threw himself at Esther's feet, begging for his life. He knew his fate was sealed, but in his panic, he made a fatal mistake. In pleading with Esther, Haman got too close, which was misinterpreted by the king when he returned to the hall. When Xerxes saw Haman prostrate near the queen, his fury only increased. He exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" The king's words sealed Haman's fate. The king's servants immediately covered Haman's face, a sign that his execution was imminent. One of the eunuchs present informed the king about the large gallows Haman had prepared for Mordecai, the man who had saved the king's life. Xerxes, in an act of divine justice, ordered that Haman be hanged on the very gallows he had erected for his enemy. "Hang him on it," ordered the king without hesitation. The irony was bitter and perfect. Haman, who had planned Mordecai's death on an imposing gallows, would now be the very prisoner of the trap he had set. He, who had schemed to kill so many, met his end on the very instrument of execution he had created for his enemy. The guards took Haman, now desperate and without escape, to the gallows he himself had ordered to be built. And so, the man who had sought power and revenge, who had planned the destruction of an entire people, met his death swiftly and mercilessly. The instrument of his arrogance became the symbol of his downfall. Haman's fall was swift and total. In a single day, he went from being the second most powerful man in the empire to a condemned traitor. And with his death, the gears of the divine plan continued to turn. The decree against the Jews still loomed, but Haman's removal from the scene cleared the way for justice and salvation to prevail. Esther, now even more aware of the danger her people faced, could not rest. She knew there was more to be done. With renewed courage, she appeared before King Xerxes once again, this time with an even more urgent and daring request. Once more, she risked everything by prostrating herself before the king and pleading for the lives of her people. With tears in her eyes, Esther implored, "If it pleases the king, and if he finds favor with me, let an order be issued to revoke the plans of Haman so that my people may not perish." Xerxes, moved by the determination and pain of his queen, could not allow such evil to befall Esther or her people. However, he was bound by the laws of the empire. The original decree could not be annulled. But where there was one law, another could be made to give the Jews a chance to survive. With wisdom, King Xerxes authorized a new decree to be issued, this time written by Mordecai, who now held a position of authority. The king gave Mordecai his signet ring, the same ring that had been used to seal Haman's decree. With this, Mordecai had the power to create a new decree, one that would offer a just and saving solution. Mordecai drafted a new decree, which was quickly translated into all the languages of the empire and sent to the 127 provinces that stretched from India to Ethiopia. The new decree allowed the Jews throughout the empire to assemble and defend themselves against any attack. They had the right to organize, fight, and protect their lives and the lives of their families. More than that, the decree allowed them to destroy any force that came against them, to take revenge on their enemies, and to take possession of the goods of those who sought to destroy them. This new order not only gave the Jews the right to defend themselves but also encouraged them to do so without fear. The support of the king himself was with them. Now, the people who were destined for destruction could fight for their survival, and the king's decree ensured they had the legal means to do so. When the new decree was proclaimed in every city and village, the effect was transformative. The despair that had once dominated the Jews gave way to renewed hope and courage. They prepared for the appointed day, no longer with fear, but with the determination to fight for their lives. What had once been a day of massacre became an opportunity for God's people to reverse their fate. The day arrived that had been marked for the massacre of the Jews, the 13th day of the month of Adar. For months, this day had been feared by the entire Jewish community throughout the vast Persian Empire. It was the day when, according to Haman's original decree, the Jewish people were to be exterminated, annihilated without mercy. However, now the circumstances had changed. The new decree, written by Mordecai and sealed with King Xerxes' ring, allowed the Jews to defend themselves and fight against anyone who tried to attack them. The enemies of the Jews, those who had planned to take advantage of the original decree to loot, kill, and destroy, quickly realized that the situation was no longer the same. Instead of defenseless victims, they encountered fierce resistance guided by faith and the strength of the community. The king's support for the new decree, along with Mordecai's growing influence at court, caused many of the enemies to hesitate or even retreat, fearing the consequences of confronting a people protected by royal law. Everywhere, the battles were intense, but the Jews fought with bravery and determination. God was with them and their victory was clear. In Susa, the capital, the Jews rose against those who hated them and defeated their enemies with great force. In the other provinces, similar stories unfolded. Wherever the Jews were attacked, they prevailed. Those who sought to destroy them were defeated, and many of those who intended to benefit from Haman's decree ended up falling because of their own wickedness. At the end of the day, the result was undeniable. The Jews had triumphed over their enemies, protecting their lives, their families, and their property. The planned massacre had turned into a great deliverance. The fear that once dominated the hearts of the Jews was replaced by joy and gratitude. The people who had been destined for death now celebrated life. But the victory of the Jews was not just military. It was also spiritual. They recognized that this victory was not merely the result of their strength, but of the powerful hand of God guiding and protecting his people. Mordecai, now in a position of prominence beside the king, became a symbol of faithfulness and faith. Esther, whose courage had been the catalyst for all the change, was recognized as the heroine who risked everything to save her people. With the Jews' victory over their enemies and the reversal that transformed the day of their supposed extermination into a day of triumph, God's people experienced indescribable joy. But the story was not yet complete. That event needed to be remembered forever, not just as a celebration of victory, but as a testimony to the power of faith, courage, and divine providence that reverses even the most desperate situations. It was with this purpose that Esther and Mordecai decided to establish a festival that would forever commemorate this miraculous victory. They knew that what had happened was not just an isolated episode, but a crucial moment in the history of the Jewish people, a moment when the hand of God was clearly visible. Thus, the Feast of Purim was born. Mordecai, now in a position of great influence beside King Xerxes, sent letters to all the Jews in the Persian Empire, from India to Ethiopia, instructing them to celebrate annually the 13th and 14th days of the month of Adar. These would be days of feasting, joy, sharing, and remembrance. The name Purim was chosen in reference to the pur, the lot or casting of lots that Haman had used to determine the day he would destroy the Jews. The lot that Haman thought was in his favor was turned against him by God himself. Every year during Purim, the Jews reread the story of Esther, remembering how God brought about great deliverance through the courage of a queen and the faith of a faithful servant. They make it a point to retell how evil was reversed and how those who plotted destruction were themselves destroyed. Children dress up as characters from the story, and there is joy in the streets and homes. The memory of Haman, the villain of the story, is erased, while Esther's courage and Mordecai's faithfulness are celebrated. Today, thousands of years later, Jews still celebrate Purim, just as Esther and Mordecai instituted. They remember with gratitude the great salvation that God granted them and reaffirm their faith in the God who never abandons his people. The story of Purim is more than a tale of victory. It is an eternal proof that good triumphs over evil, that justice prevails, and that God's hand guides and protects those who trust in him. The institution of the Feast of Purim is therefore a milestone in Jewish history. It not only commemorates a past victory, but also inspires faith and courage for the present and the future. And so, generation after generation, the story of Esther continues to be told, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, God is always in control, ready to turn the impossible into reality. This story not only depicts Esther's courage and faith, but also shows how a single act of bravery can change the destiny of many. It is a powerful lesson on the importance of standing up for justice, even when the price to pay may be high. Leave your like and comment if you would have Esther's courage and if you've ever had to make a difficult choice in your life. Thank you for watching until the end. Share this video with your friends to support our work, and see you in the next video.